Hi there, and welcome to Baden Hill. Today we're going to continue talking about the evolution of the United States, particularly during the second half of the 1800s, which we also call the 19th century. So we have discussed the Gilded Age. We've talked about how the United States was going through a big period of boom, and the economy was growing. The Industrial Revolution had led to all kinds of inventions that sped things up, and businesses were taking advantage of it. In addition, you had people who wanted to expand across what was there for them to move to. The lands of the West were not yet the United States, but people saw that it was a land of opportunity. And so during the middle of the 1800s, you had an idea that was promoted called manifest destiny. Manifest destiny basically means that it is your destiny to do something, meaning that you are designed by God to achieve a certain goal. And manifest means that it's apparent. It's apparent to everybody. In fact, it's a no-brainer. It's something that should be accepted. So manifest destiny specifically referred to the idea that white Americans would expand all the way across the continent of North America, at least sea to shining sea. And one president in particular who promoted this idea was President Polk. And President Polk was a one-time president, but he had a huge impact on the course and the destiny of the United States. In some ways, I think we can actually compare President Trump to President Polk. President Polk benefited from this boom in the economy. And also, he happened to be president at the time when there was a lot of American support for gaining new territory. And you also need to know that President Polk, he guided some of the things that were being said regarding minorities within the population. And what I mean by that is he pushed people to think that white people were better and that eventually they would take over. And that meant that they would take over the lands that had belonged to Native Americans and lands that had belonged to Mexican Americans. Now, Mexico at this time controlled the Southwest. So the people who lived in California and New Mexico and Arizona, those people were still Mexican citizens, but they were living in what today is the United States. Because of that, there was tension. Americans wanted those lands, especially California. They saw that it was a good place to grow things, and so there was a sense that California was the destiny of Americans. Well, during President Polk's time, manifest destiny gained momentum, and he was able to sign a treaty with Great Britain, England, UK. They controlled Canada, and they also controlled what today is Washington and Oregon and Idaho and parts of Montana and Wyoming. And so a large part of the Northwest was under British control. Now, there were still Americans there, and it was kind of settled together. It was disputed territory. And so a treaty was agreed to during the time of President Polk in 1846. And President Polk had campaigned on the idea that the U.S. could expand and take over that British territory eventually. And so he said 54-40 or fight. And that refers to the latitude the parallel line. Okay, we have lines of longitude and latitude on our globe. Artificial, you can't see them. But the 54th parallel, 54 and 40 degrees, is what Polk was trying to get to. But there was a compromise, and the border was established then at the 49th parallel, and that is currently the northern border of the United States, other than Alaska. You have Maine, which is a little bit higher than that. So the 49th parallel was established, and the U.S. gained a ton of territory. They gained Oregon and Washington and Idaho, etc. Well, that wasn't the end of this manifest destiny. And what happened in 1848 changed things considerably because, again, American business people and pioneers, they wanted to get into the Southwest, and it was controlled by Mexico. But Mexico had been going through revolution and turmoil, and so they didn't have a strong hold on those territories that were the south of the North American continent. And particularly we're thinking of Texas, which eventually fought against Mexico and gained its own independence, the Lone Star Republic it was called. And eventually it was annexed by the U.S. Remember, annexation means to a country takes over a smaller area and makes it part of their own country. An example in recent history would be Russia taking over the Crimea, which was a part of Ukraine. Now, that's still disputed. The United States does not accept that Russia controls the Crimean Peninsula. But the annexation of Texas, Mexico really couldn't do anything about it. So the Mexican-American War was basically fought to expand the United States. And what happened then is that territory was because the U.S. won the Mexican-American War in 1848, they took over the Southwest, they took over Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, those states, and they also were looking to include California. So they took over California as a territory, but remember, after the Mexican-American War, California became an independent republic called the Bear Republic. And so Texas and California still today have kind of an independent identity. But we know that the gold rush was coming. And so we got to go back and talk a little bit about the gold rush. In 1849, you know that at Sutter's Mill, James Marshall discovered gold on Sutter's Mill. And as a result, you had hundreds of thousands of gold rushers. We call them 49ers because it happened in 1849. And they swarmed to the gold area. And you need to know that was something that started as a gold rush, but eventually became a land rush. And we're going to talk about that more a little bit later. Well, what happened to all those people who were there in the Southwest as farmers and ranchers? Those were Mexicans, but now Mexico had lost that huge chunk of land. So what was going to happen to those Mexicans? Part of the peace treaty gave citizenship, offered citizenship to those Mexicans, and 90% of the Mexicans living in the Southwest took advantage of U.S. citizenship, but they were discriminated against terribly, and they lost their land to the white settlers, and eventually they moved to the urban areas to try and have jobs. They worked as vaqueros, and some were peons, which were basically slaves on these ranchos, these ranches, where they could still do what they had been doing for generations. But as the white settlers came in and those became states of the Union, their life was turned upside down. Another very important thing to remember is after the Mexican-American War, a decision had to be made regarding whether those states would be states that allowed slavery or states that did not allow slavery. And so there was something called the Wilmot Proviso, which said, okay, you can't have slavery in those territories of the Southwest, the new states of the Union in what had been Mexican territory. And so there was a lot of tension, and that eventually really would lead to the Civil War. And so you could say that Polk caused the Civil War because he allowed these things to happen in this way. He made it very, very likely that a war would break out between slave states and free states. Now, regarding the gold rush, so how long did that last? Really only from 1849 to 1855. It was a very short gold rush, and people swarmed and they got the gold, panning for gold, but then it was harder and harder for individuals to compete because these big businesses came with their new inventions and their technology, and they had to dig deep to get the gold, and because of that, people didn't come for the gold anymore. They came for other opportunities, such as land, and we'll talk about that next. How did the United States expand? We talk about westward expansion because obviously the U.S. started in the East Coast and then moved west across the country. And westward expansion, you could say it began with the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Now, that was basically incorporating and organizing the territory that was already being settled along the Great Lakes. And it carved up areas, and basically we talk about the crazy quilt because the farms were divided according to a grid pattern. And so if you fly over the states of the Great Lakes region, part of the Midwest, Minnesota and Ohio, places like that, and Pennsylvania, you see a crazy quilt. Okay, it looks like pieces of a quilt. And so that Ordinance of 1787 was kind of the beginning of expanding the United States. That continued with the Louisiana Purchase. Remember, Thomas Jefferson in 1800 was able to purchase a huge territory from Napoleon. The French controlled it, but Napoleon needed money to fund his wars in Europe. And so he sold the territory to Thomas Jefferson and the United States for $18 million. Okay, a steal, right? And at that time, that was a lot of money, and it would be today. But the point is, it made the United States keep growing. The U.S. kept growing. In the 1800s, we have what was called the Homestead Act. Now, the Homestead Act was passed in 1860 by Congress, but it was vetoed because it would have basically caused a civil war. And remember, the Civil War didn't start until Abraham Lincoln was elected in November of that year. So the first Homestead Act didn't pass. Eventually, though, once the Civil War had begun, the main issue was gone too, because what was happening is that the slave states did not want the Homestead Act, because when the Homestead Act meant that people could have land in the Midwest, and that land was basically not going to be slave land. And so the slave states, they wanted the right to have slavery in those states. And so it was this point of conflict. Were those new states going to be slave states or free states? And so only after the slave states were not a part of the Union anymore could the Homestead Act be passed. And one of the main things that was said is anybody who has fought against the United States cannot have a homestead. So that meant anybody in the Confederacy who had fought against the United States could not have a homestead, could not have a piece of land in the West. Gradually, it had been a big part of the lead up to the Civil War too. In Kansas and Nebraska, those territories had been kind of battling over whether to be slave or free, and essentially they were free areas. Well, one thing that happened after the Civil War, because this was an opportunity for everybody who had not fought against the U.S. during the Civil War, that meant that African Americans and these freed slaves could go and they could get homesteads as well. And so you had a mass exodus by a group called the Exodusters. They were African Americans, freed slaves, who were able to go west and get homesteads in places like Oklahoma and Kansas. The thing is, they were not really welcomed. So even though those were technically free areas, there was still a lot of racism and prejudice against these Black Americans. And finally, you have the land rush of 1889. Okay, remember that you had lots of areas that were supposed to be set aside for Native Americans, and we'll talk about that in a little bit too. But the main thing is those ideas disappeared once there was no more land. People wanted the reservations, the land that the Native Americans had. And Oklahoma, on many maps, in the 1800s, it was still called Indian Territory. And by 1889, you had a land rush to Oklahoma. So those Native Americans lost their land in Oklahoma, and Oklahoma was the location of one of the last places where there was still land to get. So in 1889, you literally had people lined up on the border of that territory, before it was a state, and they fired a gun, and those wagons went and they tried to stake out their land in Oklahoma. So the people who got there earlier were called Sooners, and that's why in Oklahoma you still have that as a motto. It's the Sooner State, because of that land rush of 1889. So that's westward expansion following the ideology, the ideas of manifest destiny. We need to talk about what happened to these other peoples, especially the Native Americans and immigrants to our country. And it's a very sad, tragic story. I'm going to go through it fairly quickly just to make this video not too long, but I hope that you do more research on this. This always is important whenever we have National History Day competitions. These are the stories that usually weren't told for hundreds of years. And finally today, people are doing research and they're learning about the Native Americans and Chinese Americans and Latino Americans, Mexican Americans. So let's start with local history. We're going to talk about Dennis Kearney and Wong Chin Fu. Dennis Kearney was an Irish labor leader. That means that he wanted to organize workers. We've already talked about Samuel Gompers and people like that who wanted to get rights for workers. Well, the thing is, when you have immigrants who also come to the country and who need jobs, there's competition between people who are here and people who are coming in. And as a result, there is a lot of racism against any foreign people who come in. The idea is we had a right to be here and we're better anyway because of certain characteristics we have. Well, Wong Chin Fu was an American who was he was educated at an excellent university in the United States, and he was a journalist, and he wrote about the fact that Chinese Americans should have rights in this country. Since 1790, Chinese Americans were not allowed to become citizens through the naturalization process, applying for citizenship. So Chinese Americans were excluded from the beginning of our country. And so Dennis Kearney, he said many powerful things talking about how, big business was using cheaper labor, and that cheaper labor was the immigrants who were coming in. They could be paid less, and the big companies could make lots of money. So logically, I understand why people have a complaint about that. And that's why we have minimum wage laws today. But, Dennis Kearney, he would always talk at the end of his speeches, he would say, and above all, the Chinese must go. So it became racism, and it became all about these Chinese workers who, honestly, they weren't doing anything to hurt anybody. They were just working hard, and they were oppressed. They were discriminated against. Many were killed. It is something that we need to wake up to and research about. And Wang Qingfu needs to be recognized as someone who was speaking against Dennis Kearney. Dennis Kearney actually challenged Wang Qingfu to a debate, but Wang Qingfu said, he was ready to debate as well. But honestly, it was about kind of a losing battle at that time. There were many Americans who did think that these immigrants were a threat of some kind, and it shows that racism was very prevalent. What about those who had been here, those who had been living here from before any Europeans, the Native Americans? Well, in 1877, an act was passed that basically abolished reservations. So the reservations had been places at least that Native Americans could continue to practice their tribal government and customs and teach their children in the way they wanted to. They had been driven off their original land and usually given the worst land in the country. But at least they had a place at that time. And then in 1877, the Dawes Act basically blew that apart. And one of the intentions was to force Native Americans to assimilate, to become like all the other white Americans, to dress the same way, to have the same government. Because of what was happening over this period, you had what were called the Indian Wars. And it was just basically resistance to, first of all, to being put on reservations and being relocated. Maybe you know about the Trail of Tears, that the Cherokee people were forced to leave their land, and many died along the way as they were being relocated. But what happened then is Native Americans were fighting back, and the resistance involved famous Native Americans, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. They were part of the Lakota Sioux tribe in South Dakota. And you need to know that gold was discovered in the Black Hills of South Dakota. Maybe you've heard of the city of Deadwood. Just know that made it something where a lot of white settlers were coming in and taking the land that had belonged to Native Americans. And eventually that problem in South Dakota became the government's problem, and they sent the 7th Cavalry to fight the Lakota Sioux. And Custer was the name of the general, and if you don't know, the Battle of Little Bighorn was the end of Custer, but it was also the end of Native American resistance, essentially. They realized that even though the Sioux won that battle, they knew that there would be more U.S. Army coming and eventually winning, and so they retreated. And one of the saddest, most horrible incidents was at Wounded Knee, where there was a massacre of Native Americans, men, women, and children. And there wasn't even something to fight about. There were some weapons on the side of the Native Americans, but the army came in, surrounded again the 7th Cavalry, and a gun went off, and then the army just started shooting and killed hundreds and hundreds of resistance. Now, what was going on in the country to fuel this manifest destiny, to make people think a certain way? One of the things that was happening was journalism. I'm going to speak specifically about yellow journalism because it's easy to remember. And just you need to know that journalism, writing in newspapers, it was becoming this massive weapon. Now, Dennis Kearney, he had been just a speaker, and he had 2,000 people listening to him at a time down by the courthouse here in San Francisco. But with the media, you can reach hundreds of thousands of people at the same time. And so the media was a new kind of military for different beliefs. And yellow journalism came about at the end of the 1800s, which is the period of the Spanish-American War. And two men, Hearst and Pulitzer. I'm just using their last names to give you less to memorize. Hearst and Pulitzer were the two figures that basically had a media war with each other. And it was about many things, but specifically it was about Cuba and what we should do, the United States, in Cuba. And it eventually led to the Spanish-American War. So Pulitzer, and we have a Pulitzer Prize named for him. Pulitzer, he basically ran the newspaper, the New York World, and the New York World was essentially against war. Okay, it was against war in Cuba. It was against the Spanish-American War. Hearst started out in San Francisco. That's why we have Hearst Castle in San Simeon, if you've ever been there. William Randolph Hearst started a newspaper that you've probably seen called the San Francisco Examiner. And his newspaper became huge, the biggest newspaper. And he used his success to also purchase a newspaper in New York called the New York Journal. And so there were two New York newspapers then competing for subscriptions for customers. Pulitzer had the World and Hearst had the Journal. And they competed by lowering the price of their newspaper. So Hearst lowered his price to 1 penny a day, and Pulitzer's was 2 pennies a day. And so Hearst was able to gain a lot of customers, but then Pulitzer had to lower his price to meet Hearst's. And so that's what it was at the beginning. And they started creating things that would draw in people. And one of them was a comic strip called The Yellow Kid. And before you think too much into it, you need to know that this wasn't a racist cartoon. But when you look at it, you're kind of wondering, why was this made? This cartoon character was a bald child with buck teeth. And so many people would say, wait a minute, is this making fun of Asian people in the United States? And possibly there was that undercurrent. But the main thing you need to know is there isn't any evidence that it was racist. It was just actually talking about problems in New York and politics in New York City. And so the Yellow Kid comics eventually gave the name yellow journalism to this movement and this newspaper media war. Well, eventually Hearst said, basically he was responsible for starting the Spanish-American War, for getting people fired up. And Pulitzer had been against it, so that becomes a reason that people would buy one newspaper over the other. And so you could say that Hearst won the yellow journalism war, and he became so rich and so famous as a result of it. That's why he had the money to build that castle. But you need to know that there were people who were writing against Hearst's ideas and just the corruption again. Like Mark Twain, you have another man named Stephen Crane. Stephen Crane wrote a famous book called The Red Badge of Courage, which was about the Civil War and talked about how war is not always kind. War is not always such a glorious thing. And this carried over when Stephen Crane went as a correspondent to cover the Spanish-American War, and he was in a boat that actually sank, and he was adrift on the ocean and finally rescued. But it's important to know that Stephen Crane saw the dark, ugly side of the Spanish-American War. And so I wanted to mention that and help you see that there are people who are going against the idea that war is such a great thing for the United States. So, because of the Industrial Revolution, many inventions were being created, and that meant many weapons were being created. The Industrial Revolution also meant that factories and businesses had to find places to sell their products. And so an expanding United States gave potential for businesses to sell more of their products. One of the things that I didn't mention that happened during this time was the Transcontinental Railroad. And I talked about this earlier during the Gilded Age. But just imagine, when you have those railroads, it connects the United States. It gets products from one place to a very far away place much quicker, and they can sell more. I need to tell you that my ancestors were called the Baden brothers, and they started out in Kansas, and they were able to take advantage of railroads. And what they did is they actually heard that the miners in Colorado, in Leadville, Colorado, they didn't have fruits and vegetables. And so in Kansas, where there were lots of fruits and vegetables, they could box them up and they could get them to the miners and sell them for a huge profit. And so my family made a lot of money that way back when. And they gave that money to the church. They built a Lutheran college, and they also contributed to the church. And so hopefully we can at least see that the money went to a good use. But this competition for new markets and new customers, this was a worldwide thing. And someone like Karl Marx, who basically invented communism, he saw this happening and he said, eventually there won't be any new markets, and this kind of life, this way of life and business, it's going to fall apart. And so that was his prediction. It hasn't happened yet. People have just kept reinventing markets and products, making products, technology products. Well, one thing that happened all over the world, there was this desire for new colonies. We've already talked about the U.S. and its colonies, but there was also a scramble for Africa. We will discuss this more in detail in the next unit, but just know the scramble for Africa, it started with a conference in Berlin, and it ended up being a terrible, terrible thing for the people of Africa. Africa had already suffered through slavery, through European nations coming and being a part of the slave trade, and there were native Africans that were making a lot of money and becoming powerful through the slave trade as well, because one tribe would capture another tribe and then sell them as slaves. But really, this was driven by European greed and American greed. And so the scramble for Africa basically sliced up Africa, and Europeans were able to claim colonies there, and always looking for resources and for new markets to sell products. Because of all these colonies and European countries kind of competing, you had an arms race in Europe. And this also happened in the United States. The United States participated by selling weapons to Europeans and selling weapons to other countries. And so they made a lot of money off of this arms race. But when you have a lot of weapons being created, remember, arms means weapons. Otherwise, that's kind of a weird image, an arms race, racing on your arms. But just know that this has many consequences. So colonization and a military arms race, they have consequences. One of the things that happened was in South Africa, where there was a Dutch colony that was eventually taken over by British control. There was a war between those Dutch colonists and the British newcomers, and that was called the Boer War. And so that happened at the beginning of the 1900s, the same period. There's a lot of competition and fighting within the colonies around the world. And so we need to remember that there were revolutions happening at this time as well, in Mexico in 1910, in China in 1911, and there was a lot of instability. So you have colonization instability, an arms race. What do you think is going to happen? World war. But God's always in control, and God will always bring light out of the darkness. Let's look for that as we move forward.